At the end of every course or semester comes the moment of reckoning. You have to assign exams or papers, grade them, and give each student a grade for the course as a whole or the project as a whole. Students are very eager indeed to get high grades, but they haven't always mastered the material sufficiently to deserve them. There's likely to be a little friction or disagreement at this stage of the term. To prevent it, or at least to minimise it, you need clear policies, clearly stated right from the outset, so that you know what the grading policy is and they know it. In the same way, in the workplace, there's likely to be friction and disagreement as employees are not evaluated as highly as they expected to be. It's universal for people to estimate their own abilities perhaps a little bit more highly than they really merit. And of course, it's difficult to receive a less than glowing evaluation on projects or courses that you've done. If possible, you should remind the students of something they might not otherwise realise, that as their teacher, you'd much rather see them succeed than fail. After all, there's really no greater tribute to a teacher's ability than his or her students' success. Now, that remark will diminish, but won't remove, the adversary feeling that comes with grading and evaluation. Because people are unequally gifted, and because they vary in how much work they do, the outcomes are going to vary. Good teachers will try to evaluate and measure those outcomes as accurately as possible, making sure that the range of abilities and the degree of effort devoted to the course are accurately reflected in the outcomes. It's always a good idea to temper justice with mercy when you're grading, so as not to discourage a hard worker who may need more time than others to understand or master new skills. But you have to make sure that your generosity to weaker students who tried hard doesn't blunt the value of the high grades that you give to the very best students. In college education, a student who doesn't succeed may be steered towards another major where they might be more successful. We all know plenty of people who maybe were headed for med school but couldn't do the organic chemistry, the thing we heard about last time, but who then prospered in another area. So grading can actually be a helpful indicator. It can be useful to students, even though it doesn't feel useful at the time you get the bad grade, but a guide to where their actual strengths and aptitudes lie. In most colleges, as the term comes to an end, the students get the chance to write an evaluation of their professor. And these are evaluations from which teachers can learn, and which they should certainly use to try to improve the quality of their own teaching. They're usually written anonymously, which is good, so that the students can be honestly critical. Obviously, a student's got an incentive not to criticise the teacher to his or her face during the semester from fear of reprisals, but anonymous evaluations are useful. And when many of your evaluations all say the same thing, you can be sure that they're telling the truth, and that's an area that you'll need to work on. Exams. Exams should fully test the student's knowledge of the course material and their thinking ability about it, their style of thinking. And exams should be designed so that they can elicit the full range of ability levels in the course. Before writing the exam, ask yourself, what do you want the students to take from the course? If it's mainly a way of thinking, then you need to provide the data to test their ability to think in the way you require. On the other hand, if it's mainly a body of knowledge, set questions that demand evidence of their having acquired that knowledge. But don't leave it till the exam comes up. Make sure that the students know throughout the course the things that you're concentrating on, the things you're most eager to teach them. And usually, of course, as I've said throughout, it's going to be a combination of method and content. In my case, it's going to be how to think historically, and then how to apply that style of thinking to the particulars of 20th century American history. So the exams ought to be a test of both. But of course, you should make sure that the students know that they're not taken by surprise by the exam. And in exactly the same way, in the business world, employees should be tested to make sure that they've mastered a certain body of knowledge and a certain way of deploying it, the facts and figures, and the circumstances under which this body of knowledge should be used. The principles are the same, whatever the teaching environment. Now, when you're writing your exams, you should try to write the exams in such a way that they'll distinguish as many degrees of competency or proficiency as possible. It's very easy when you get the exams back to differentiate the very good ones from the bad ones, but it's much more difficult in the middle to differentiate the fair from the poor. And a well-written exam will give you the capacity to make as many different gradations of quality as possible. It's very hard, actually, when you're reading through lots and lots of exams, especially because they're often handwritten hastily in strange, spidery scripts. It's often hard to sort out the big grey middle. The best will stand out, the worst will stand out, and the middle ones are where your challenge will come. Multiple choice exams work well for questions where a definite right answer is possible. On the other hand, they're deficient if it's a matter of questions of judgment. As I've said already in this course, the most obvious weakness of multiple choice is its failure to require students to write. They make you distinguish between fine shades of meaning, but they don't make you express fine shades of meaning. Multiple choice, I suppose, is defensible in cases like advanced placement tests because they can be impartially machine graded and you can get fairly direct comparisons of students literally all over the nation. But on the whole, multiple choice is very regrettable in higher educational settings. Although again, I admit that it might be acceptable in situations that simply require specific factual knowledge. The steps that have to be taken in a particular medical situation, for example. Essay questions are much better, however, because they test the student's ability to think conceptually and to make individual facts or factors cohere into an intelligent whole. This too, essay writing, can be very valuable in business situations where a good writer will show evidence of understanding how the individual steps in a process can be integrated to improve productivity or efficiency or morale. So on the whole, essay tests, although it's more difficult to grade them, are strongly encouraged. There are different ways of giving exams too. In-class, take-home exams, and oral examinations. They've all got drawbacks and they've all got benefits. In-class exams give an advantage to fast writers who can deal with high levels of stress. When I was an undergraduate at Oxford, incidentally, the exam system in those days, it's now changed, was incredibly stressful. After 3 years of college work, my degree was entirely dependent upon my performance in 10 3-hour written exams. Nothing else mattered. No matter how distinguished or undistinguished my work might have been up to that time, only my performance on these 10 exams mattered. And we began on Wednesday, and we did 2 on Wednesday, 2 on Thursday, and 2 on Friday, had a couple of days off, and then did 2 more on Monday and 2 on Tuesday. So 6 hours a day. Oh, and also we had to be dressed. We had to wear black suits and white shirts and white bow ties, a uniform called sub-fusk. In those days at Oxford, there was no continuous evaluation or assessment at all. Now, not surprisingly, that examination system was preceded every year by a handful of nervous breakdowns from students who simply couldn't take the stress as the exam time approached. And of course, it gave a terrific disadvantage to anybody who happened to be ill just then. None of us can control when we're going to be ill. And if you happened to be ill when finals were on, it could have ruinous consequences. Now, the normal American system of continuous assessment, that is, of grading many things along the way during the semester, is surely a much wiser policy. It has what you might think of as the advantage, or you might think of as the disadvantage, of making it more difficult for the students to slack off at any stage and of spreading out the anxiety which the students are likely to feel if they're deeply preoccupied by grades, as so many of them are. With take-home exams, on the other hand, you lose the ability to regulate the examination room conditions, and you create opportunities for cheating. You can no longer really control how much time the students spend on it. Implicitly, when you let the students take exams home, you're giving them the opportunity to check the web and to check books and all the rest of it. That means what you're really doing is setting a higher standard for the students to achieve, since they will have access to so much more information, and since generally they'll have more time in which to do it. Students often think that a take-home exam is easier, and occasionally I've even invited the students to vote. Would you like a take-home or an in-class exam? They vote for the take-home, but they may be actually imposing an additional difficulty on themselves in doing so. What about oral exams? Orals reward students who are fluent talkers but don't write so well. If you give an oral exam, you've got to decide whether you're going to reward degrees of articulacy. In other words, are you going to reward the best talkers? Now, that's obviously right in the case of a foreign language. If you can really talk that language well, you've learned what was necessary. What about an oral exam in history? It's a bit more difficult to say there whether eloquence should be rewarded. When I was a graduate student at Berkeley, the PhD general exam I took at the conclusion of my coursework and before I began to write a dissertation was just one 3-hour oral exam. There was no written exam at all. I loved talking and I enjoyed it, but again, the preparation for it felt very stressful because so much depended on that one 3-hour period, and it was just a matter of talking. Incidentally, it was also very difficult indeed to get 5 professors together to do the exam for a 3-hour period. My oral exam was at 7 o'clock in the morning on the very first day of the semester, the only time we could get them together. Well, oral exams, take-home exams, in-class exams, likewise present a teacher with different advantages and disadvantages. Orals require the teacher to be alert and active and discriminating as a listener. There's no opportunity to go back and reconsider. You've got to be alert all the time. If you're doing it with one student, that's okay, but if you're going to do it with dozens, it's much more difficult. Take-home exams are often longer, and therefore there's more to read, although it's more likely that it will be typed and therefore a bit easier. Take-home exams are also more challenging to write because they've got to demand as much of students who have access to books and materials as the in-class exams. In fact, really, from the teacher's point of view, the in-class exams are probably the easiest to grade, apart from the problem of the bad handwriting. Now, before exams come up, well before exams come up, you should always tell your students what the exam is going to be like. Tell them what kinds of questions are going to be there. I might say there's going to be an essay question, and then there's going to be a series of short answers, and there's going to be a map, so that they know exactly what the format is, and I even tell them what the distribution of the grade is going to be to cut down on the number of surprises they feel when the exam starts. I don't want to spring anything on the students. I don't want to feel that they've been entrapped. In fact, I often say, when you get the exam, you're going to read through it and say, ah, yes, that's exactly what he told us he was going to give. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that the students won't try to squirrel out of me exactly what the questions are going to be, and I resist that. But at least they know what the format is. They find the exams very stressful, and there's no point at all, I think, in intensifying the stress. I go into quite a lot of detail. They see it, they do it. Very often with map questions, it might say something like, here's a map of Cold War Europe. Name the countries. And remember that many of them changed their names and changed their boundaries after the end of the Cold War. I also correlate time with value. I'll say, you should spend 60 minutes on the essay question, and it's going to be graded out of 60. You should spend 10 minutes on each of the short answers, and they're going to be graded out of 10. In other words, I give 1 point per desirable minute's work. And if the final grade is out of 150, I'll just multiply by 2 and divide by 3 to give a percentage grade. Pop quizzes, they're popular they're not popular from the students, but they're popular among the professors. They're perfectly acceptable as well. In fact, it's a very good idea because if you give pop quizzes all the way through the semester, it's much more likely to keep the students coming to class, it's much more likely to keep them alert, and it means that you're spreading out the graded material over the longest possible time. Announce at the beginning of the term that you're going to give them so that the students are warned. Now, you should also decide on your grading policy before the beginning of the semester, and then you should stick to it. You remember that one of the early lectures of this course was a lecture on planning. This is one of the things you should plan right at the beginning. How am I going to grade this work? Think back to the goals and objectives you've got, refer to your syllabus, and then stay consistent so that students will even know what's going to be graded and when it's going to be graded. If you give numerous grades over the course of the whole semester, the students are going to know how they're getting on. It's reassuring to them to know, all right, I'm getting a B, and that means I'm not really trying as hard as I want to. I must work more so that I can bring my grade up. If they simply don't know, it induces a greater sense of anxiety. And if you can, grade different kinds of things, short papers, research papers, class participation, presentations, and examinations. Those are the things I usually do. In math, homework on problems is a routine part. Lots of research confirms that your teaching is more effective if you test the students' comprehension and understanding several times rather than waiting until the end of the semester. It's just an obviously good thing to do. Now, earlier also in the course, we heard from Professor Pollock about the clickers. The beautiful thing about the clickers is that he's able to ascertain in class immediately, even in a class of 300 students, whether and to what extent they're grasping the material being taught to them.
Let's do some clicker questions.
He doesn't grade the clicker work, but it's a beautiful tool to have to get a sense of how people are picking things up. And they can certainly guide him in his writing of exam questions.
Any last clicks?
Use of the clickers shows how well the students are comprehending, and they give the students an understanding of how they're getting on as well, where their weaknesses lie, where it might be necessary to do some more work. I used to have students announce to me, I'm going into this exam with an A. They'd say it very confidently, partly as a way of kind of stampeding me into agreeing to the idea. And I hadn't given them enough contradictions along the way. Now, by having lots of intermediate graded materials, they can claim that they're going into the exam with an A, and I can politely contradict them and say, no, I'm afraid not. Look at the following 7 grades you've got so far. If this was now the end of the semester, you'd actually be getting a B minus. It's more useful from my point of view because it cuts down the degree of uncertainty, and that cuts down the degree of squabbling that's going to ensue after the grades are delivered. Intermediate benchmarks, the more of them you've got, the better. Now, another thing you've got to work on when you're grading is to decide whether you're going to reward progress or whether the grades are going to be apportioned equally over the coursework as a whole. In other words, right from the beginning, should every graded piece of work carry the same value, or should you give more weight to work that's done later on as the students have become accustomed to your style and to the style of the discipline itself? Should a student who gets a C on the first piece of graded work be incapable of getting an A at the end? Some teachers address this problem by saying, when it comes to giving final grades, I'll omit your worst grade. Or they say, I'll give greater weight to the exams you do, to the grades you get after the midterm exam. And I think policies like that are often a good idea. It creates an incentive for the students to work harder. But whatever the policy is, announce it and then stick to it. Of course, it depends partly upon the character of the course itself. In some cases, a mathematics class, for example, mastery of later material relies upon the material covered early in the course. Sometimes it seems appropriate and reasonable to drop the worst grade. At other time, it really makes no sense to do so. So look at the nature of your work and think of a consistent and intellectually defensible grading policy. You also need to decide whether you're going to grade on a curve or according to an absolute standard. Some professors take the view that the students are competing against one another and that there won't be more than 3 A's in a class of 30, and that therefore the best students are going to have to compete to get those A's. I don't take that view. In my history classes, I'm content to grade the students according to an absolute standard. My experience has been that sometimes most students in a class are great, in which case I give them nearly all high grades, and that sometimes the dynamics of the class are simply much less good and most of them don't work all that hard, in which case I'm content to give most of them poorer grades. But this was a point with which Professor Roberto at Bryant University disagreed. He's a professor of business, and here he is discussing his own grading philosophy as he prepares his students for the competitive business world. He thinks it's entirely appropriate to grade on a curve and to have them competing against one another. Then we'll hear from Professor Hale at the University of Louisville. This is the archaeologist, whose point of view could hardly be more different.
My own philosophy is that it's helpful to have multiple ways of evaluating whether the students are learning the material. I think testing and projects and papers are partly about evaluating, but partly they're also developmental. They're partly about helping them further develop their skills. And part of the only way that they can do that to some extent is through taking the knowledge that they've gathered and the frameworks and having to apply them through an exam or a paper or an oral exam or a project. And so that's the developmental experience. That's helping them further learn. So I don't view it as simply evaluative. I think there is that component. We have to give them a grade. Have our exam. The grades are on the back, so if you just come over and grab your exam on the way out, you'll be fine. Thanks, everybody. But I try to create projects where I feel like they will come out of it richer for it. And so that's why tests are only a small fraction of the overall picture.
I ask on that first day, I would like everyone to get an A+. Is there anyone aiming for a different grade? No one ever raises their hand. And then I talk about what they should expect they need to do to get that A+. And I try to make the first assignments count for minimal amounts. So they've got some feedback from me about their writing, about their mastery of the subject, at a point where they can still say, oh, I got it now. And it's not too late to get that dreamed of A+. I tell them I would like to get a nasty letter from the provost accusing me of grade inflation because everybody got an A.
Well, now, obviously, the two of them disagree completely, and yet each of them makes perfect sense. In a business environment, to perform most successfully can be directly tied to things like salary increases, that sort of immediate material reward. Whereas when you're studying something as removed from everyday life as archaeology, it's possible that everyone will do well or that everyone won't do well. I think Professor Hale himself was almost kind of defiantly over-optimistic. Of course, the reality is, as he knows perfectly well, that not everyone's going to get that A+. But he's going to give everybody, including himself, the benefit of the doubt for as long as he possibly can. It's particularly difficult, in my experience, to grade participation, because that can mean so many different things. As I suggested when we were discussing discussion, some students love the sound of their own voices. Others are shy and reluctant and have to be coaxed out. One of the reasons, as I said, one of the reasons I cold call is to make sure that everybody has participated, so that if I'm doing some participation grading, I've got something to grade. It becomes easier to judge once you've made everybody speak, because then you can say, all right, how well did these students in fact grasp the material and then put it into their own words? Professor Roberto has had the idea of asking for student input in his evaluation of class participation. Each student names the 3 other students who made the most helpful contributions to the class discussion each time. They're not allowed to make negative comments, but they can commend the particularly well-prepared among their own peers. If you're grading participation, you do need to emphasize up front that merely saying something is not enough. I've often had the experience with discussion of assigned readings that there'll be a student who right near the beginning of class will raise his hand and make a brilliant summary of the first 10 pages of the reading. And what he's hoping for, of course, is that I won't come back to him and that I'll have the feeling that he was a good participant and that I'll never notice that he didn't read the rest of the book. So you've got to be aware of the possibility that the students will be manipulating you in cases like that. Now, what about grading itself? A lot of professors regard grading as just about the very worst part of the job. Is there any way that you can make it fascinating rather than just a dreadful chore? I've talked repeatedly about student procrastination, and now I've got to admit that the faculty members are also procrastinators. They often procrastinate in getting the grading done. Sure, it can be dispiriting, especially when it shows that the students didn't really learn what you hoped they would learn. It's very repetitive, but repetitiveness is sometimes a good thing. Think about baseball. Baseball's all about exactly the same set of motions with tiny variations, and yet most people love it. I'm not saying that it's as much fun to grade a set of papers as to go to the baseball game. But still, grading can have its own fascinations. It's another of those dry pleasures I mentioned before. For one thing, the students' naivety as writers gives you a direct glimpse into their heads. I'm always very aware of this when I'm grading papers. They're not subtle enough as writers to disguise themselves. I get up and grade early in the morning when I'm wide awake. And I counsel you, if you've got 30 papers, to grade them in quick succession. Keep at it until you've done them all. Because in my experience, it's possible to suddenly break through to a feeling of deep satisfaction. Runners talk about runner's high. You run and run and run, it's painful and miserable, and then suddenly you come out into runner's high. In the same way, it is possible to get grader's high. This is a point I've made to many of my colleagues. Some of them say, oh, I felt that too. Others say, oh, I never have. I wish I could. Anyway, one of the things to be aware of is this, that if you're not careful, your standards will change as you go through a set of papers. That means that it's fairest to read a few and give them just provisional grades, maybe pencil it in, and then read those early ones again when you've got a sense of the general level of the group, so as to make sure that your standard isn't going to change along the way. Another thing I've done increasingly in recent years is anonymous grading. When I give a midterm or a final exam, I say to the students, just put your student number on the front of the blue book, that's what we use, little blue booklets, so that when I'm reading the exam, I don't know who wrote it. And in this way, as I'm grading them, I'm not thinking, oh yes, this is Catherine and she's a great student and I'm going to give her a good grade because it's her. I simply read it on the merits, and then quite often when I compare the numbers with the names, I'm surprised in good and bad ways. You should decide on a policy for grade disputes if your school doesn't already have an established procedure. The current generation of students are very ambitious for good grades, and they also tend to have a fairly high sense of entitlement. They'll argue over grades. Most schools respond by having a definite policy. You should learn that policy. Now, some students will treat the grade you give them as something like the sticker on a used car, a bargaining point. They'll say, okay, you're saying B+, I'm going to start at A-, and we'll work from there. Now, in general, it's a very good idea never to change grades, because word travels fast, and if you change one, you're going to have a lot more people in your office also saying that they'd like a grade change as well. And increasingly, we have to deal with complaints from students' parents. Although luckily, federal education privacy laws prevent us from having to discuss the grades with the parents unless they've got the written consent of their children to do so. If a student does dispute a grade, you've got several options. One is to say, no, I never changed the grades. One is to request that they submit their reasons for wanting a change of grade in writing. That's enough to deter some because they don't really think they deserve it. They're simply hoping. A third possibility is to meet with the student and hear their explanation of why they think the grade should be different. And you might say, all right, I'll revisit this grade, but with the understanding that if my evaluation is lower, the grade might go down, just as if I think on the balance that I was too harsh, my grade might go up. It's probably a good idea to show some flexibility, even though in the end you come back to the grade you gave the first time. But of course that means that your initial grading should be very careful and very conscientious. Now, students would like to believe that they get the grades they deserve, but actually they're the beneficiaries of grade inflation, both in high school and in college. There's no doubt about that. We've got very, very hard data on the way in which over the decades the grades have just kept rising. But listen to the students talk about it. Do you think you're the beneficiary of grade inflation?
Definitely not. I feel like I would have rather been.
So you would say that you got the grades you deserved, or did you think you got less than you deserved?
I would say I got the grades that I deserved, but I feel like I worked a lot harder for them, and I feel like just the level of difficulty of courses here, especially science courses, greatly surpass a lot of other schools.
Have you been the beneficiary of grade inflation?
I would say no, not at all. My high school did not have that. It was very rare to do well in the AP and IB courses.
So your impression is that the grades you've got are always the grades you earned, neither more nor less?
Yes.
Average grades across the broad spectrum of American education have risen steadily for decades. Now, this is partly due to the students' sense that they're consumers. They're paying massive tuition fees to be there, especially in the colleges. And as with shopping, so with college, they tend to believe that the customer is always right. It feels very hard to be told, yes, you paid $38,000, but all that did was give you the right to compete for a good grade. It sounds like a very bad bargain when you put it in those terms. One of the many temptations we have to resist as teachers is that of giving students better grades than they deserve because we know what a fuss they'll make if we don't. I've often had the experience of thinking, if I give this one a C+, I know there's going to be a terrible fuss. Nevertheless, C+ is the right grade, and as I write it, I can feel the storm that's going to come. You have to steel yourself to give the deserved grades, sometimes with a sense of sorrow and dread in your heart. Now, evaluation can be an effective aid to teachers in improving the quality of their work. It's a challenge to obtain honest evaluations because of the inequality of the teacher-student relationship. And that's a shame because students really are the experts. They're constantly comparing teachers. And their ideas and suggestions are more often helpful than they themselves might realise. But of course, the students themselves hesitate to offer honest feedback unless they can do so anonymously. That's why the anonymous evaluation process is an important and valuable one. Most colleges require or encourage student evaluations of their teachers. Some are numerical, some are written. The numerical ones, the college administrators love the numerical ones because they can be averaged to a number accurate to several decimal places. And that gives the administrators the feeling that they've really got some statistical exactitude on just how good the teachers are. But actually, as a teacher, it doesn't give you very much to go on. The written ones are much more useful. And when you get written ones, when you get written evaluations, you should read through them, discard the very best and discard the very worst, the outliers, and then take seriously the middle. Take seriously the middle ones. If students repeat remarks again and again about your teaching, take them seriously and modify your teaching style accordingly. Of course, it's very tempting to treasure the best ones and to agonize over the worst, but you need to discard that. Remove both temptations. And remember that there is such a thing as the wisdom of crowds. If 20 out of 30 people say, the professor talks too fast, then you do talk too fast and you've got to work on slowing down. I found it very useful indeed to give a mid-semester evaluation as well, an anonymous mid-semester evaluation, even if the school I'm working at, in my case Emory, doesn't require it. Because then, if the students have already got some common problems, they've hesitated to say it to me in person from fear of reprisals, but they're willing to say it anonymously, and so I can respond. And that means that during that semester, things can get better. Your feedback to the students during the semester obviously is much more valuable than it would be afterwards. And of course, so is theirs to you. Let me summarise now what we've learned in this lecture. First of all, make sure that you already know on the first day of class how you're going to examine and grade the students, and tell them how you're going to do it. Consider the sort of feedback that you'd find helpful, and tell them if you're going to ask for mid-semester evaluations of yourself from them. Explain what sort of feedback you'd find most helpful, and say to them, if you'd like this class to be conducted in a different way, consistent with what we're doing, please let me know. Give plenty of graded assignments throughout the course to show students how they're getting on and to give you a more objective record of their achievements. This will reduce the element of surprise and the element of possible dismay at the end of the course. Temper justice with mercy and give yourself a little leeway to reward students whose improvement or conspicuous effort is praiseworthy. You've also got to expect a little bit of cheating and plagiarism. It only happens occasionally, and it's not your fault. Although you should certainly give assignments that make it nearly as difficult for the students to cheat as to do the work they should have done in the first place. In the next lecture, we'll turn from these matters to the question of how a veteran teacher can maintain a sense of enthusiasm and avoid falling into a rut, even though he or she has been doing the same work year after year.